Okay, so welcome, Mr. Jody Lee Lipes. Thank you for being here with us, and we're gonna enjoy you for 1 hour and something, hopefully. First of all, let us know where do you came from. What's your background?
Well, I grew up near Philadelphia, like in the suburbs outside of Philadelphia. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I just everybody in my family had a love for movies and all like different kinds of movies. So I got a pretty good sampling when I was a kid of a lot of different kinds of film. And yeah, and then I ended up going to film school at NYU. Was lucky enough to get in there. So that's kind of how it became a little bit more of like the idea of a career or a job to me. And yeah, and so I guess my last kind of non film job was the summer after high school when I was a bellboy in Massachusetts. Um, with my friend Evan. But since then, it's just been all film, working in the repair shop at NYU, and I was a wedding videographer for a long time. Um, and lots of jobs in between. Yeah.
Nice. Did you when you first started getting film jobs, was it one where like camera or lighting?
Well, yeah, I think I the first movie I ever worked on was called Palindromes, and it's a Todd Solondz film from that was shot I think in 2002 or 2003, and um, Tom Richmond was the DP, who passed away recently. He's a really great guy. And basically, that the laws have changed since, but there was a lot of interns on that film doing a lot of jobs that interns don't normally do. It was a very very low budget movie, and basically they found out that I knew how to load and sort of work the cameras that we're using on that movie, which were 16 millimeter cameras, the same ones basically that we had at school. And because I had been working in the equipment shop and the repair shop and everything, and because I had been shooting a little bit, I was really familiar with those cameras. So after I interviewed to just work as an intern on the film, they're like, "Oh, well, if you know this stuff, you should go into this department." And I met Tom Richmond, the DP, and they ended up asking me to load. So I was a loader on that project, 16 millimeter, and but I guess because I was stupid and inexperienced, didn't realize like how good of an opportunity that was, and to learn and just to see what a real film was like. I kind of made demands when they hired me, and so one of the most important thing to me was that I got to work in lighting, because I felt like I had a pretty good amount of exposure to, the equipment, not necessarily in a professional situation, but just the equipment itself in terms of the camera equipment. But with lighting, it was just more of a mystery to me, and it was something that I felt like, and I still feel is like the lifelong pursuit of being a DP, the thing that you can really like never learn enough about, and that you're never really like a master at, is lighting. Um, to me, it's the hardest thing about being a DP. So I really wanted to work in the lighting department on this small film. And so I told them I'll be the loader for the first half of the movie as long as you let me work as a grip or electric in the second half. And so when the film was halfway done, I went to the producers and I said, "Okay, I'm ready to go into the lighting department." And they were kind of like, "What?" And the first AC Craig Prescurove, who's a great first AC, he's still working today in New York, was I think pretty annoyed at me and disappointed, rightly so. But I then went and started working with Melissa Gamera as the key grip and Matt Hill, the gaffer. And I really feel like that was one of the most formative experiences of my education. You know, it was like I think I learned more in those couple weeks than I did really in all of film school. Um, just having my hands on lights, like physically doing it, like laying cable, just the things that I think as a DP, unless you've physically done it, it's hard to, I think it can be hard to talk to people about it. And I think it can be hard to understand really what you're asking someone to do and how difficult it is, or simple it is. And you know, I still don't know all of those things, but I think it really helped that I physically did it for a while. So from that point forward, professionally, I was always trying to work in lighting when I was a matter of crewing. And I felt like I learned more from that and I was more challenged by that, as opposed to camera, which I think to me, I think I also just am not a technical guy and like don't know a lot about cameras and lenses and stuff, but I guess maybe I rely more on the camera department than other people do. Um, but I feel like that's not where I want my energy to go. Is like the nitty gritty of that stuff, and that I'd much rather be putting my energy into lighting, learning about lighting, like coming up with a plan for lighting, responding to the lighting, and let like the camera sort of be taken care of by other people like as much as possible. I think is, you know, and there's also times when I've tried really hard to like I'm going to operate this whole movie by myself. Like, I'm going to be here. Like, this is going to be my focus of this film. But I think generally speaking, like, I'm less concerned with like being close to the camera and I'm more concerned with the light and the storytelling as a, you know, overall more than anything.
Well, one of the things that I admire most uh, from your work is precisely that, how attached your lighting is to the storytelling, and how effortless your lighting looks. It's very naturalistic and very beautiful in every single movie you've shot. Uh,
Thank you.
is it is it something that comes natural to you, or are you chasing that from the beginning of your career? Or how that
Um,
happened?
I think um, a lot of the time I'll find myself on set, you know, a month into a movie or the you know the end of the first day of a commercial or whatever, and I'll think to myself like, oh, I never told the gaffer or the key grip that like that I think that this looks good. um and I think and I feel guilty about that, and like I should um tell people that I think that they're doing a good job and that like we succeeded in what we're trying to do, but I never feel that we did. And I think that's not because I don't like the way the movies look or I don't think that it's correct. I think it's just this, it's never going to be perfect and you can always do more. And it's just sort of like, it feels to me a lot of the time like, okay, like we have this amount of time and then we have to stop. But like there's always more you could do. Um, and So it feels like it's something you can't like put your hands around, and like you can't hold, and it's just constantly changing, and it's constantly like out of your control. And I think for me that feeling of being out of control, and like the fear, I think it starts when I read the script. And like I just did an interview for a film with a director, and there's this whole it's a very small movie, and there's this whole sequence outside at night, and it's, you know, takes place in, you know, 2000 years ago, and there's no light sources, and it's like a huge, vast landscape where you have to see all this stuff. And so in the interview, one of the first things I said to him was like, "Can that be during the day? Because like I don't know. Like I feel like it's gonna hurt the movie." Um, and and that became like a conversation, like what would that mean, like would that be better, would that be worse? But I think that like anxiety um continues all the way through prep, and then through like a blocking rehearsal for me is like very fraught, because if there is one, because it's like, oh well, if they were over here then I'd be able to. And I try to like turn that part of my brain off a lot because I don't want to inhibit the process. But yeah, it is a feeling. A lot of the time, it's not like excitement or like accomplishment. It's like anxiety, and then it's very quiet. Like I don't think anyone knows that that's how I feel. Like I think generally people think I'm really calm. I would comment a lot of the time that I'm so calm on set, but I think that's the feeling in it, and it continues through the lighting process, and then it continues through like shooting, and then while you're shooting it's a sometimes a feeling of like, this could be better, or am I going to be able to fix this in the grade, or what if I had done X. And then also as the sun is changing, just like how much are we going to do preemptively to put ourselves in a situation where I can just turn my brain off and not worry about what's happening outside, so that it's affecting inside. And this actually was actually a pretty huge issue on this movie I did, called The Good Nurse, with Jessica Chastain and Eddie Redmayne, because it was the first time I had experimented with this new way of shooting with really, 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 really high ISO throughout the whole film. And it took me a little while to understand what the kind of pitfalls of that are, and things that I need to do to be able to work, in a way where consistency is possible, in that situation. So anyway, just to say that, like, you know, I always worry about consistency. I always worry about, is this right? Is this good enough? Is this real enough? Is this like interesting? Um, and all of those things. So yeah, anxiety, I guess, is how I feel about it. Not that it's natural.
No, that's just like ever present, man. That's the price you pay that comes with the job, right?
Hmm.
Super high ISO. What was? Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, what did you go with a specific system, like the FX3 or something, or Sony Venice, because of that?
Yeah, we decided to use the Sony Venice for that movie, and it was sort of a debate initially, and sort of a process initially of like, are we shooting on film? And then once that was ruled out, like halfway through prep or whatever, it was like, okay, it's always the same thing of like, okay, if we're shooting digitally, like how do we make this not just look like every other show on Netflix or whatever? You know what I mean? Like, just that it just doesn't have like this sort of look that um, is nothing. Like that's always my internal struggle of digital, like is harder to me to make it feel right. And so then it becomes like, well, how is that going to happen? So then initially it became like a big lens testing process for me, probably like the most thorough and exhaustive lens testing that I'd ever done. And I was leaning towards anamorphic. We shot a bunch of anamorphic tests and some spherical tests at Panavision in New York, and then when we screened the the tests for the director, like blown up, in a DI suite in a theater, because it's a theatrical film. The director felt like spherical was the right way to go, and I agreed with him But in the process of testing, I had also just experimented with like, well, like what if we shoot this at, you know, 2000 ISO? Then it's like, well, what if we shoot this at like 3200? And then it's like, well, what if we shoot this at 6400? So I had like done a bunch of setups with various lenses, and then I had also experimented with the ISO levels. And so when we decided to in the room to shoot spherical, then it was like, okay, well, what about this other thing? And the director, Tobias Lindholm, was like, "Oh, I like this. This one looks good." And it was like the really, really high ISO, the 6400 ISO. And we're looking at it in a theater, so it's like the most noisy and sort of the most apparent that that choice will ever be. And I felt like it took away like a cleanness or like like a plastic look that digital can sometimes have. And this is sort of like a grittier film in a way, and I was hoping to like give it a look that supported that a little bit. And so that level of noise, that like base level of noise, ended up being a good way to emphasize that. And and also, like the film is about a nurse who works in an ICU, and she works the night shift. And so we essentially like built the entire ICU inside of a pre-existing building, and we tented the entire building so that we could shoot during the day instead of at night. Um, and so we had like total control of the light, what was outside the windows, what was inside. And um, as we were shooting that, it was amazing because I could work at like very, very, very low light levels. And, that's something that I always tried to do. Even shooting on film would underexpose a lot, but this was like a whole other level. And just using, like using Asteras in the sort of dressed into the ceiling that were like 1%, and then it's like, can it be lower than 1%? And sort of like these kinds of questions started to arise. And it's like, well, if we diffuse it with
Yeah.
magic cloth like twice and put it at 1%, and like, so that stuff started to happen. And it was really interesting. And just the quality of the light, in my opinion, became like really, really unique because it was softer than it had ever been able to be before, because I could diffuse it more. I could use much smaller sources, like if they were inside the room or outside the room, like much smaller sources, and diffuse them like many times. So it's like going through like a small source going through like three distinct layers of magic cloth or whatever. So it was just like really, really, really soft. And it was also, I think, for Eddie Redmayne, it was really helpful to his performance because it was so dark in the room that, I mean, it was dark. And he felt, he said after that he felt like there was no one else there, that he was just by himself and he couldn't see anyone else. And I think so there were advantages, I think, in terms of the performances. And but then, when we went out into the real world, it was a different story. Um, I almost immediately started noticing, like, wait, what happened? Did like is it overcast? Like, did clouds come out? And like go outside, and it would just be like blue sky, and it was like there was like a wisp, like like you couldn't even see the change with your eyes, but like a very, very low level of cloud that was almost imperceptible by eye would affect the light, the ambient light, like coming into the set in such a dramatic way that it was like, oh my god, we can't, like, there's no way to keep this consistent. And then also the LUT that we were using for that film works in a way where the brighter something is, the warmer it is, and the darker something is, the cooler it is, to kind of increase color separation. But so as the luminance was like changing, the hue was changing dramatically. And so it took me a little bit to realize that what I needed to do when I wasn't in a totally controlled situation was to start with a base level of like several stops of ND,
Hmm.
so that it was harder for these very slight imperceptible ambience changes from outside to affect what was happening in the room.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the time what we would do is just really try to eliminate the possibility of any changes happening from outside the house or out, any of those sort of external light coming in. But we also combine that with like starting with a base level of ND. So having this increased noise level, the sort of like softer image that resulted from shooting at such a high ISO, the light quality, the advantages that we were able to have, but then also like needing to start at a level where it wasn't like really like shooting at 6400. So, and then also with my colorist, like adjusting the LUT a little bit during production so that it was like a little bit less sensitive to these minor changes in terms of the hue shift. Um, so, like that was a really good lesson for me. And then I did a similar thing on the next project, which is a TV show for Amazon called Dead Ringers, that I did with Sean Durkin. But I had much more control of the process that time around because I had done it before. The gaffer had done it before. So we had just a better understanding of how to deal with it.
Yeah, that was my question. It feels like your episodes on Dead Ringers are like a follow up of the Gut Nurse. They have this kind of the same vibe. They're hospitals too,
Mm-hmm.
so they have a very similar vibe. And I have to say that the look on the Gut Nurse in a hospital, it's the best I ever seen. I mean, you really created something different to what everybody else does it because of what you just explained. It's really something.
Yeah, Shane Valentino was the production designer on The Good Nurse, and I think he just did an incredible job building that space and really taking the time to collaborate with me in a way I hadn't done before, since that before that project, in terms of like integrating lighting and sort of like how the set was laid out in terms of like where there was glass and where there wasn't, and how like we'd be able to see through spaces. And his reference for that was really brilliant, which was a film I had seen many times before, but never thought like, oh, this would make a good hospital set, which is a documentary by Frederick Wiseman called Near Death, which is about a hospital in Boston, about an ICU in Boston. And just the layout of that space, which is, or at the time, the layout of that space, which is a real hospital, is really different. And it's really like you can really see through like multiple layers. And yeah, so I think the layout of that space, the integration of the lighting in that space really combined with like, I think this sort of a really high ISO look like made it, I think, a unique hospital look. Yeah.
Totally. When you're going through and prep and you're starting all that out and you're pulling references for something like that, is it tough to find anything to show the director? Or like, do you guys pretty quickly get on the same page, or how long does it take you to be like, that's what we're going
Um,
for?
yeah, I don't know. I had a really long prep on that movie because the director, is from Denmark, and it was like a question of like when is he going to come out, and wanting wanting to get started really early in term to be able to build this whole ICU, and wanting me and obviously Shane, the production designer, to be involved in that whole process before Tobias, the director, was there. So I don't know. I mean, I think I I have a habit of looking at things like scene by scene and like really breaking down each scene. And I think that's part of where the look comes from or the references come from are like scene specific. But then, um, like the real thing for me, I think, on every project since I shot a movie called Marcy May Marlene, like in 2010 or 11, um, has been like shooting tests where I try to have as many elements from the real film there as possible, whether that's like, the real actors or using real locations or whatever makes it really like test, like this is the space, this is the person, this is the wardrobe, whatever, and like do that as much as possible, and shoot a bunch of different stuff that really could be in the film. I always find that I've been lucky enough so far that when I do that, there's always one shot that like it comes up on the grade and it's like, oh, that's the what the movie looks like. And then I start to think about like, well, why? Like why does this one feel right to me? Like what technically about this, or like what is it that makes it feel right? Is it just what's in front of the camera, or is it like the texture of the image, or is it the lens, or is it the grade, or what? Like what? What is it? And then I think in breaking that down, it's sort of like a backwards way of doing it. In breaking it down, then I can isolate like what I'm trying to do on the film. Um, like what I'm trying to like impose on the film or trying to like embrace on the film. Um, and so I think maybe with The Good Nurse, for example, like um, it was it was like really dark, like really like low ambience, right? Like where it's an ICU, it's nighttime, like the patients are sleeping for the most part, like the nurses are kind of trying to not wake them up. It's like that kind of feeling. For me, like you can do that so much more. You can go so much farther if there's like a really bright thing in the
Mm.
background, right? So it's like looking at like what are the practical lights that we're using, where are they going to be, and like having this like bright sort of like recessed fluorescent looking you know fixture on the top of the frame, like in the background, lets like everything in the foreground be able to be much lower. Or like if the windows are in the background, it's like having these like bright spots in the background, and that lets the foreground be darker. And then it's like, how do you carry that through when you're not in the hospital? Like, what are ways you can do that when you're not in the hospital? Like, do you want to go as far when you're not in the hospital, or back off of it a little bit? Like, and it starts to work sort of backwards from there. Like, what's the kind of central image and like the space you're in the most, and then like how do you kind of like work out from there?
Uh, one of the you have to be now probably the guy who knows most about shooting with one actor playing twins.
Mm,
You've done it twice,
yeah.
and one of in one of the shows, I know this much is true. You had another challenge, which is Mark Ruffalo had to have to gain weight,
Hmm.
and you had to shoot the guy inside the same scene like 3 or 4 months later.
Hmm.
So, uh, besides the challenges of the technical challenges of VFX and stuff like that, I think that's the most difficult thing to do as a DP. I mean, you have to match the light inside the same shot. It's not the next shot of the previous one. So my question is how you did that.
Yeah. Yeah, talk about anxiety, right?
Yes.
The yeah, so it was it's HBO show. I know this much is true. Mark Ruffalo plays twins. It was a 117-day shoot for a 6 hour show,
Wow.
6 episodes. Um, and the first, I don't know, however long, was Mark as one brother, and then the last several weeks of the show, the last, I don't know, 4 weeks maybe, were Mark as the other brother. And yes, going back on location to the same place, no green screen. There was, I think, 2 or 3 shots in the entire show that where we used green screen. Very, very little stage work. And yeah, I think the the way that once I got over the trying to just avoid twinning as much as possible on the show, which is like Derek and I were both trying to avoid it, Derek the director, in prep. Once I realized, like, I can't really avoid this. Like, I can't assume that the visual effects will be horrible. I can't assume that, like, I need to just work around this. Like, I have to do it. I have to learn how to do it. Um, then it was like, okay, so we're going to shoot this shot. We're going to shoot the majority of the scene. And then in 4 months, we're going to come back to the same location. We're going to have to find the exact camera position. And we're going to have to recreate the light, even if the weather is totally. Do you guys see these balloons?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It loves what
we're
you're
gonna
talking
have
about. Yeah.
we're gonna have to recreate the light even if the weather is totally different, right? So in sort of the most exposed you are obviously was when you're outside and shooting a sequence. For example, there's a scene where the two brothers are visiting a waterfall that is right next to a graveyard. So they walk, there's a long, very long panning shot of the two of them walking through this graveyard. And I don't know how long it is, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, something like that. And so shooting that on the A side, where Mark was the first brother, it was like, it's really important that the light is overcast. Because if the sun is out and it's 4 months later, the sun's going to be coming from a different direction. Like, are we going to only be able to shoot in this like very specific time of day? And what if the sun isn't out and all that, whatever. So in that situation, it was like, we need overcast light. And then when we shoot the B side, when we come back 4 months later, like, let's try to schedule it so that it's on an overcast day. And if that day before we feel like the weather isn't right, we'll shift it to, move the schedule around. But because it was the very end of the schedule, it became like increasingly difficult to move the schedule around because there's just not that much left to shoot. So I think in that scene in particular, it was like, okay, well, if we can't really like guarantee the weather is going to be what we want, we have to shoot this like after the sun is low enough in the sky that there is no direct light hitting the actors. And so then you have this really narrow window to get this long scene. And it's hard enough just to have Mark like walk in the right place, like so that the timing is correct with what was done 4 months before. And the camera is like really long lens doing this really, really long pan. But he pulled it off and Derek pulled it off and it's great. But that's sort of what you're trying to do is like, you're trying to think ahead, like these are the things that I won't be able to recreate or match. So we need to do this other thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously like inside it's easier, but it's still a major thing of like, okay, we're seeing and the way Derek shoots, it's so unwieldy and it's not really like planned in a traditional way. So you don't really know where you're going to be looking a lot of the time, even while you're rolling. And so it became this thing of like, okay, well, we don't want any direct light coming through any of the windows. Like we have to put like huge eyebrows or get like fly swatters like all around this building so that when we come back, we can do it again, or like maybe it'll be overcast. And that became like sort of the big picture thing, was like making these choices ahead of time about how to control the light as much as possible in a very out of control like shooting style. And then like the nitty gritty of it and like matching it really precisely in terms of like, because we're shooting on film, not being able to just put two images side by side and like light it that way, but light it from memory and light it by like documenting like this is two stops over, this is one stop over. Um, my The gaffer Ken Shibata is incredible, and the key grip Johnny Erskine um, just really like got into the nitty gritty of like this is half a stopover from what it was before, so it can't be that way. So we have to do like X, Y, and Z. And that I left that largely to them. So like if there is really good consistency there, a lot of it is because of those guys and their teams. Because it was like I was like, my head was gonna explode, and I was kind of like, okay, so this is what we did before, so like it's your job to do this again. And Ken is, he's very calm, he's very thoughtful, he's very thorough, and he just, but you also have to keep in mind it's like Derek will roll for a full mag. We're shooting two perfs, so you're talking about 22 and a half minutes every single time. And so documenting like on this take four, which is what we're like, the motion control is like, we're repeating take four. At the beginning of take four, this is kind of the levels that we're at. And like 22 and a half minutes later, it was like kind of like this. And the part we're using is like halfway in the middle. So it was like I was just like, Ken, do whatever you think.
Wow.
Do what you need to do. But it worked out really well. And the other thing was like the depth of field, like trying to make sure that that matched. And it's this thing of like another complication, which I think sometimes when I talk to people about this, they're like, well, yeah, but you're just going to use like Mark's body from the B side. You're not going to use like the whole environment. So it's really just his body that you're needing to match light wise. And it's like, well, I mean,
Depends, yeah.
how many times, like not just on this film, but because it's an art unto itself. I mean, obviously, and it's a creative process, like the visual effects. It's like as you're shooting commercials or whatever, so many times visual effects people, oh, actually, you know what? We are going to use the environment from this side, not the other side, or whatever. And so it's like you just never know, and so you have to assume um, that everything is relevant, and that's makes it much harder than just being able to assume like it's just this part of the frame that matters.
Mm, totally. Sounds like a lot of anxiety and a lot of kind of higher concept techniques on these latest ones. Is anything like going back in your IMDb? Is anything like Trainwreck less of a anxiety, or does that have? I'm sure it has its own challenges, but is that a little more like, hey, we can wing it kind of thing, or yeah?
Well, Trainwreck. I'm looking at the Blu-ray actually. The Trainwreck was a really big step for me because first of all, it was like Judd Apatow, which is like a hero of mine from when I was a lot younger, and then a producer on TV show I did called Girls. And then like the fact that I got that job was just crazy to me. I was pretty young, and it was like my first studio film, and it was just a much. I think the biggest movie I had done up to that point was $1 million, and that was like almost 40, I think. And so it was just a big. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was very, very reliant on the gaffer and the key grip and the operators and the AC. Like I was just learning from them. So, but I think also, like part of that is the politics. Like you're learning about, like I think I was used to working on like movies with my friends, and it's like, okay, so we're gonna like do this scene at night, and everyone's gonna stay up all night, and then we're gonna like shoot in the morning, and then like it was just sort of everyone was like, no one had kids, and it was a different vibe. And then Trainwreck was like everyone were adults, they were all grown ups, and it was there was a different set of priorities. Um, and so I was learning that? Like, how do you, and also everyone knew each other really well. Like a lot of people have been working with Judd forever, and I was newer to the equation. So it was like, how do you get what you want, or like communicate to people like what you think is important and have them um, consider it or like believe you or take it into account when you're like the newer, younger person. Um, and
I
so that
understand
was,
that.
yeah, that was like a big learning process for me. And I was probably like a little bit too young to be doing that movie, honestly. And it was like following in the footsteps of like Janusz Kaminski and, like Faden and all these like huge DPs. And then it was like, and me. And so, it was a lot to step into. Yeah.
But a success. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
the movie did very well. Yeah, the movie did really, really well. Yeah.
Going to your last movie, Earth Mama, you went. I believe you shot that movie 16 millimeters.
Hmm.
It's a very beautifully raw looking movie. Uh, who chose to shoot 16 millimeters, and was it easy to uh, nowadays in 2023 to producers to let you do it? Because I tried several times and I never was successful.
Yeah. Well, so the director of that film is Savannah Leaf, who is a brilliant filmmaker and someone I had done a couple commercials with before this film. It's her first film, and excuse me, and she from day one, film was just part of the equation to her, just period. And I think in my experience, the last several times that the last TV show I did was on film. The last movie I did was on film, Earth Mama, and I guess before that was I Know This Much Is True. I think in all three of those situations, it's just been the director being like, "This is what we're doing," and not in a way where they can be talked out of it. Like it's an essential part of the process to them. And so I think, a lot of the time what happens is it's sort of like it's presented as a choice where it's like, well, you can have this, but then you can't have that. So we can shoot on film, but you have 2 days less to shoot. And a lot of people will respond to that in a very sane way, which is like, well, fuck, well, I need those 2 days. And then there's people who say like, no, we're shooting on film and that's it. And if it gets brought up enough, it's like, okay, I'm leaving. Like, if you ever talk to me about this again, I will leave. And I've seen that happen several times, and I really feel, and that's not me saying that, that's the filmmaker saying that. And I think that's the only way I think that people stop and kind of realize like this is really important. It's as important as the story, it's as important as whatever, like it's just essential. So I don't take any credit for uh, being able to use that format. In fact, when I've tried to push really hard for it, like on the Mr. Rogers movie, for example, or on The Good Nurse, it just doesn't work because it's just not an essential part of the process. And that doesn't mean it's not as good, or it's just not part of what was really important in those stories to those filmmakers, and or to the studio really didn't want it or whatever. And so yeah, I think it's very complicated though. Like as I've talked about before, it just a lot of the time the reasons that you get from whoever it is that's concerned about it or trying to stop it or thinks it's going to hurt the project or whatever, the reasons that you get um, don't always feel like they're real. They always, in my experience, they always shift and change as the process goes, where it's like if you solve one issue with shooting on film, then immediately there's another one. And so I think, and I've said this before, but I think a lot of the time it has to do with fear, or like a fear of a lack of control, which I totally understand. As I've said in this conversation, like it makes me really uncomfortable when I can't control things in a film, and shooting on film still makes me really scared. But I also know it's like it's good scared. Um, it makes me like not sleep sometimes, like while I'm shooting, like before the dailies come back, or whatever. But I also feel like it's easier in a way. It's easier to get to, obviously for specific projects, not all, but it's easier to get to a look that feels right for me a lot of the time. And so even though it's harder in a lot of ways, it's easier in terms of like the end result being correct. And so basically, very long-winded, circuitous way of saying, like, Savannah decided that we were shooting on film, and I think initially she was thinking 35, and as we talked and talked and talked, it became 16 became a better solution. And I think she was initially concerned about like some very specific things about 16. And as we did more research, and as we both sort of like showed each other films and watched a lot of Ed Lockman's work, specifically, she started to feel like it was the right choice. Yeah.
Do at the end of these film projects with these naysayers, do you ever have people come back and be like, "Hey, we were wrong. That was the right choice"? Or do you get like a sense of it? I'm sure nobody says it outright, but do you get the sense that like, "Hey, they see it now. They see it."
Well, I think it's I don't look at it as like the producers on a film who are trying to dissuade a filmmaker from shooting on film are like have a bad agenda, or like I think they're a lot of the time they're trying to protect the film, like they're trying to like make sure that the film doesn't get into trouble, and that the filmmaker is given enough time and opportunity to do what they want, and that they're not going to be like forced to narrow the filmmaker's options, because of the cost, or because of the time difference, in terms of getting the footage back, or in terms of like being able to strike a set, or whatever, like all those things. Like so, um, no, I mean I've had like a really um, successful, powerful, experienced executive producer come up to me on the last day of shooting and say like, "Isn't it amazing that we ended up getting this?" And when like he was the voice of the studio, essentially being like, they're just saying no, and this is why. And he was sort of like the voice of the studio, and so but then like was really happy about it ultimately. But I think he wanted it too. He just was trying to like be realistic about what it was going to mean.
That makes sense.
So yeah.
Earth Mama has a very consistent color palette through the movie, like the pastels, the blues, the pinks. Is that something that Savannah came with from the get go, or is something that you and the production designer and Savannah just talk about?
Yeah, much more Juliana, the production designer, and Savannah, in terms of the palette. I'm really bad at that. Like, I'm really bad at sort of making palette decisions ahead of time. And I've talked about this before, but I just feel like so many times in the past it's been a discussion, and then the realities of the film come in, and like the realities of production come in, and then it like disappears. And so I think for a lot of my career, I just was sort of like blocked it out. It's like if they put it in front of me, like if they put it in front of the camera, like if they actually like do the work to make this happen, then like that's great and amazing. But like I'm not gonna really put too much energy into that. And I also just think that's not totally how I see. Um, and it's not really like what is important to me or like my brain reacts to in an image a lot of the time. But I think, but the last project I did, the last TV show I did, which hasn't come out yet, which was directed by Janixa Bravo, um, there was really a strong palette that like really they really worked hard to maintain throughout the film, and it's there. And I'm not at all responsible for it, but I do really appreciate that it's there. And I think in this film, yeah, it was definitely those two and not me making that happen. But yes, it is. It's there for sure.
Nice. When were there any like special technical considerations on that last show? It's you kind of like tried a few new things recently. Did you go into that with the same high SO vibe or?
Um, no, well, so the last thing I did was on film. It was on 35. It was a TV show for the BBC, called The Listeners, and it's no, it was I guess what was different about that for me was um I think it's like the cleanest thing I've ever done. It's like the negative is like really healthy, which I've never done before, and it's like sharp lenses and just like it's kind of like more lit than I think I've ever done before. Thumbs up. I don't know why that's happening, but thumbs up. And so it's different in that way. And I think I was always afraid that that was just going to look really vanilla. But I think because of Janixa and Katie, the production designer, both so talented, it doesn't look vanilla. And so that was new. And yeah, and also I think a lot more stage work than I've ever done, where it's like, there's a whole house essentially that we built on a stage, and there's a lot of windows, and there's like a huge backyard that's visible. That's a stage, and um, making that feel and look real was a new thing for me. And I was kind of shocked at how well it worked out. So yeah, those were kind of the new things for me, as well as being, doing a long shoot in another country, which I think this is the first time I've ever done that. But like learning the whole sort of system there and the rules there as I went, and that was new. Yeah,
What country was that?
I was in England,
Oh,
in Manchester. Yeah, yeah.
Do you have a working pattern when you get the script and you read it for the first time? Do you have a pattern, a way that you always do it, or it's every movie is different? Meaning, do you read the script and then think about the lighting and find references and yada yada, or you don't have a pattern and it just you go with your guts?
I think since 2018, which is when I started the Mr. Rogers movie, with Mari Heller. I think that's when I started doing things that the way that I've done since then. That was like a kind of to me like a a whole new experience of shooting where I felt like I think before that I was always a little bit embarrassed about being a DP. Like I didn't that's not really what I wanted to do, and I didn't feel very challenged by it. And I thought it wasn't like my real job. Like directing was harder, so that's what I wanted to do, and it's harder for me, so that's what I wanted to do. But that movie really changed my perspective in it, and I felt like a DP for the first time, and that I was like learning how to do the job um, for the first time. And so, and on that film, what I started doing, which I've done since, is I sort of like the short way of saying it is like I basically broke the movie down scene by scene. Um, but I guess everyone who does that has their own way of doing it, and I kind of like developed a way that I've just repeated since, which is essentially like the first thing is, when I read the script the first time or like the first 10 times, like I don't really think about how it looks. I'm thinking about, even if I wanted to, I just can't. But I think about, like what the story is and what's important. So the first thing I do is once the script is locked, meaning like for those people who don't know, like each scene has a number, right? And then like from that point on, like once the script is edited, that scene, even if it moves to the end of the movie from the beginning, it always has a number that stays the same, so you can always identify it. So once the script is locked, then I write, sort of like a summary of each scene individually, and I try to keep that as brief as possible. So like ideally, it's one sentence long, but in that sentence, I try to, um, summarize like everything that's important about that scene narratively. So there's sort of like, it could be like, like so and so meets whoever for the first time, right? Um, and then there might be a note that like in the previous scene, it's important to remember that like X, because that relates to like this thing, right? So that if you're just reading the one scene, that you remember that there's like an important relationship that you need to keep in mind while you're doing that comes before or after or whatever. Also, if there's like a film where there's some kind of progression, like, trying to think of a good example of this, but basically like there's a reoccurring situation where like the first time, like I don't know, Rosemary's Baby, for example, it's like the first time that she realizes that there's something off with the other couple who lives in the building. And then there's like, then this, the next time she questions them is like here. And then the next, and then like all the way up to like she knows that they are doing something wrong. Like now she knows that they're doing something wrong because of X. So I try to like sort of put those things down in my own words. It's the only way that I've found that I can really keep the whole film in my head. Is that I'm essentially like transcribing the film in my own words. Um, so like that's the very base, sort of like the most basic thing about what I do, and then it continues into like very very nitty gritty like technical things. Like on the Mister Rogers movie, we used, let's see, like 5 different kinds of cameras or something. So it's like, which camera is this scene, or like is it more than one kind of camera, and then like color coding that so that you can like scan through it and be like, okay, this is the only time like in this section of the film that this camera is used. And and then maybe if there's like different lenses for different scenes, or there's whatever is like unique to a scene, or like, and then you can kind of like map it out and you can see how it develops. And I think this is something that I think a lot of directors find to be really helpful, because I think it's the kind of thing that they're trying to work on and keep in their head, but like, and that other people aren't always helping them do. But I think it can be really helpful, like as you're having discussions in prep, there's like so much going on, and you're like on a street corner somewhere, and it's like, oh wait, so what happens here? And it's like, oh, someone says like, oh, this is, the scene when like blah blah blah, and then it's like, oh well, also there's this other scene. It's like, well, what's that other scene? And then you like literally like read them my summary of it, and it's like, oh yeah, and then that's important because blah blah blah, and it's like all on my phone, and it's like really easy to search, right? And it's like, so there's all this information that's like immediately available. And then part of that is like location photos of the specific location for that scene, or like if there's references, or if there's like a video you took that is a specific shot that the director wants to do, and you can like put a link to that in there. And like once that document is far enough along, you can share it with the crew, and then it's like the day before they can look and be like, oh shit, we need to make sure we have the like X, Y, and Z for tomorrow because this is the camera we're using, and these are the lenses, and this is how you're not, this is a 2 camera day or whatever. Like all of the things that they need to know ahead of time are in that document. Um, some people use it, some people don't, but it's there for someone who like wants to use it. It's there, and I think the same is true for directors. Like I think it really helps directors a lot of the time, and they're really thankful for it. Like in a production meeting or scouting or whatever, like it's very helpful to them. But like Savannah, for example, like she just took that and like ran with it, and it became like both of us made it together. And so it was like a big reference for her in prep and in production, and a reminder. And then like shot lists can go in there, like all this stuff that is relevant to like a specific scene is all broken down. So that became like a big part of my prep process. And then also the testing I was describing earlier. It's like do a test as soon as possible, like get the real actors there if you can, get the real locations, whatever like crazy technical stuff you need to like look at before, like do it as early as possible so you can look at it, you can grade it in a movie theater or like in a DI suite, and then you can, if it's wrong or if the director hates like whatever element of it, you can do another one and then do it again. Um, and so those are like I think, and like obviously location scouting is so important, like being in the space of the director is so important, going to locations ahead of time with the gaffer and key grip when it's just the three of you, or like the three of you and like the rigging gaffer and key grip, and just talking generally like, well, this is, these 3 scenes happen here, like this is going to be day for night, like just so that it's not like the tech scout, which is usually traditionally like the first time that everybody's all together in a space, that there's never enough time for the gaffer or the key grip on a tech scout. And it's always frustrating because everyone's like, okay, we gotta go, we gotta go. And it's like, well, we have to talk about this because
It's a classic.
if we
That's a
don't,
classic.
yeah, it's a classic. So pushing to have those people, like I always want to have the gaffer and the key grip there as early as possible. Even if they're just like sitting in the office for a couple of days, like there's gonna be things that they um, think of, or that they're worried about, or that they want to discuss with you that you didn't think of, or that they're going to make better or whatever. But actually like going to the space with them, I feel like is just huge, because then it's just not as abstract of a conversation. It's like they've physically been there. They realize like, oh, this, you think it's going to be easy to shoot day for night here? Like you're wrong. Like this is why. And then you realize, you start to be able to say to the producers like, okay, like if we're doing this day for night, it means like X, Y, and Z. And them knowing that like a month out instead of like a week out is a big difference. It's more of a fighting chance of being able to do it the right way. So those are all big parts of prep for me, and just as much time with the director as possible.
That's great. When you because you direct too, obviously we a couple episodes of Girls, the Sinners. When you do that, I've looked through it. It seems you've worked with other DPs. I have like 2 questions. Like first of all, love it or hate it, giving up that role, and then second, do you kind of because you do such a thorough prep, do you expect that? Do you receive that back from the DPs that you do work with in that capacity?
Well, I haven't directed that much. I've directed a little bit, and I haven't done it for quite a long time. But when I did it for television, the first time I did it was on Girls, and I was in my 20s, and I was just, I mean, that was like way bigger than anything I've ever done before, and I just was hanging on, like I wasn't able to like think like this is how I'm gonna do that. It was just sort of like, okay, what's tomorrow, like what's happening? But I think the way I feel about it generally is like when people ask me that question, or I ask any DP that question, I feel like there's always a smile on their face because they think it's like um, this thing where you're like, it's going to be a competitive or like frustrating experience because like the director feels like they know more than the DP, or they have this really specific way they like to do things, and like that's going to cause conflict or whatever. I look at it in a very different way, which is I think, it's like there's a reason that Warren Beatty is like a great actor's director. There's a reason that like John Cassavetes is a great actor's director. There's, like people who do the thing, like I think understand how it feels to do the thing. And so, like, in the same way that I was talking about, like, I think it's really important to put your hands on lights when you're younger, like, at some point, like, to do that physically because it helps you understand or communicate with a gaffer, an electrician, or whatever, like, or a key grip. um, I think being a DP, it's much easier for me, I think, to communicate with a DP. And I also think in particular, like when the few times I have done this, it's like, to me, it's like a relief to like not have those things that, weighing you down. It's almost like I kind of like don't even care about how it looks in a lot of ways. Like I'm just sort of like, this is a different challenge for me. And like what I need to be focusing on is like this other thing that's way more hard for me and like not as natural to me. And I think maybe like I'm more focused on like the storytelling of like where is the camera, like what is the shot, and a little bit less on like the nitty gritty of like the aesthetics because it's like the show is the show. But yeah, so I think I think of it of like I understand the psychology of a DP. Like I think a great director like treats a DP like an actor, just the same thing. It's like in a lot of ways. And you're going to be able to get a better performance out of an actor if you know what it feels like to stand in front of 100 people on a camera and do it. Um, and so, yeah, so that's why like I think I'm really good at communicating, and I think a lot of the time it's basically like talking to an operator or something. I mean, it's very similar on like an episodic TV show. It's like they know the job better than you a lot of the time anyway. So it's like because everybody has been doing it, and it's just sort of like so. Yeah, it came pretty naturally. I think from my perspective, that's how it felt at least.
Watching your movies this past 3 or 4 days, I noticed something that you don't move much the camera in your movies, but when you do it, it's very noticeable.
Mm.
Like, I mean, the last movie I watched last night, Earth Mama, the camera almost doesn't move, but when the camera moves, it's like a 40 seconds dolly or something like that. And
Right.
same on I Know This Much. It's true, the camera doesn't move much, but when it moves, it's very, very noticeable. But I noticed that in your movies since Martha, um,
Hmm.
is it something that you pursue consciously, or it comes with you naturally? And I don't know, because you work with several different directors, and they all seems to embrace that style.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time it's just like I feel like, wait, why are we moving the camera? Like, is this like covering something up, or is it like trying to put emotion into something that isn't there on its own? Or I think that's, I don't feel the need to do it a lot of the time because I think a lot of the time I'm like wanting like the physicality of the actors to like dictate what the camera is seeing or not seeing. And so I think there's that, but then I think part of that is also probably just me being afraid of moving the camera because then it means like you're not perfectly controlling like what's there, and like lighting is way harder and it's like less precise. Um, so there's that, but then I think on on I Know This Much Is True, it was Derek's idea, and where the camera is almost like entirely Derek on that movie. But like he had this thing like the no dolly shots. Like the only thing that we're gonna do is pan and tilt. And I think we planned like one or two dolly shots like the entire film, and then one of them or both of them got cut out. But um, unless it's like a handheld camera where like the actor is moving and you're following them, like there's no dolly in the whole film. Um, and then yeah, with Savannah on Earth Mama, we started talking about Michael Haneke a bunch, and then she was really into Code Unknown and his movie Code Unknown, and there's one of the first big scenes of that movie is like a very very long lateral tracking shot that goes like several blocks of somebody walking on the sidewalk and then all the way back to where it started. Um, and for her, that was just a really powerful um, shot and like storytelling technique, and then it ended up that we ended up employing that a few times on the film. And yeah, so but yeah, I think part of it is just me like wanting a reason. Like when I do commercials, a lot of times like a director's like, oh yeah, and then like this is a dolly shot, and I'm just like, wait, what? Why? And then it's like, oh yeah, it's a commercial, like, and that's there doesn't really need to be a reason. And like sometimes I do end up doing it sort of begrudgingly, and then I'm like, oh yeah, this is way better. Like I can't intellectually justify it or like think about it, so I don't do it on my own because I need to be able to like rationalize it. But then when I do it, I'm like, oh yeah, this feels much better. Like this person is right and I'm wrong. That happens a lot. So it's like laziness and fear, I guess, are part of the reasons I don't do it that much. But I also think it can work, and like the simplicity of it can be really powerful. Like you don't need to dress this up, like that feeling, which I feel like is something that I respond to a lot in like Harris Savides and Gordon Willis's work. Is like you don't need to dress this up. Like it is what it is, and it's powerful on its own. If the narrative is right, if the performance is right, then if like what you're looking at is right, if you're looking at the right thing, then like you shouldn't really need to dress it up that much unless you're doing something like very stylized and theatrical, and like that's part of it. That's part of the story and part of the world. Um, so yeah.
Hmm. Do you I think you might have mentioned earlier. Do you mostly operate yourself, or do you work with an operator? Like,
Yeah, I don't usually operate myself like on commercials a lot of the time. I do because it's just a little bit more the way that world works. And if you ask for one, a lot of the time it's sort of like, oh, that wasn't budgeted for. But on long form, yeah, I've worked with operators mostly, but the last two long form projects I did, I decided that I wanted to be on camera more and I wanted to operate myself as much as possible just because I felt like it was making me sloppy, or I'd gotten in a habit, especially when you're shooting on film, like being away from the camera, I feel like is it makes you like a little bit too removed from the process sometimes. It's sort of like digitally, you can see better if you're not at the camera, I feel like a lot of the time. And then with film, it's the other way around. Like you can see better if you're see the lighting better if you're at the camera and like looking from the camera perspective, even if you're not looking through the eyepiece. Because I think, at this point, um, so I've been lucky enough to shoot film a bunch of times now. It's like after a few days of shooting on a project, it's like the way you're really lighting is just by looking. Like usually what I'm doing is like I'll take a meter reading of like one part of the scene, and then like if I know what that is, and like everything else is sort of by eye. And so if you're not sitting at the camera, you can't really see the lighting because it's from a different angle or whatever. So it's just this tension of like, to me, being near the director is really important, and like hearing, even if they just like make sounds or something during a take, like it's important to, if you can be there for that, like you learn a lot from it, and you can like do fix things before they even need to say it and stuff like that, and just have like a closer relationship to them. But then that's also just because I like the director to pay attention to me. I think secretly, like that's part of it. But I also think like you you just it's a much more like collaborative, like in sync relationship if you're not like in a tent somewhere far away from them. Um, yeah, it's like, but I also get obsessed with like seeing the best monitor in the perfect angle when I'm really trying to light precisely. So that means like when I'm shooting digitally, like that I am in a tent a lot of the time. So like my favorite thing is like when the director comes into my tent because then we're together, but we're seeing the right way, which is usually not possible.
Hmm.
So yeah.
You also don't feel very attached to any kind of camera or lenses. I've seen, I went through your movies and what kind of tools you used for them. And I mean, you shot film 1635, you shot Venice, you shot Alexis. Uh, is it anything that you like better than others, although you choose the right tool for the right job, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it was like I didn't know what the project was and I don't know who the director is or whatever, and then I'm just like, what's your favorite thing? It's film, and that doesn't have to be like 65 millimeter. Like that could be like whatever, like as long as it's film. Um, but yeah,
And what
I do
lenses?
think it's
So, what lenses will you choose if you there's no project, film, and
yeah. So this is another a big flaw of mine is I think to me the focal length is the most important thing. So like 3 millimeters one way or the other to me can have like a big impact on how I feel about a shot. And that ultimately I think is the most important thing.
is that why
So
you choose master prime so much? Because you got like the biggest array of lenses.
I think there's been a bunch of different reasons, but that is one of the reasons that I like that set. I also feel guilty when I pick it because I feel like it's just this easy, like don't you don't have to think about it. It's like so just nothing, you know? But yeah, I think yeah, there's been a bunch of different reasons, like very specific reasons that are all different for using this, but um yes, focal length is so important to me. I I no, there isn't really like a set. I mean, I think I do have a weakness for anamorphic, and I've been shooting like large format anamorphic a bunch in the past few years, digitally, which is kind of an interesting, cool thing. But I also feel like that's just because it's easy, like it like always looks nice. Um, but yeah, I don't with lenses, I don't know if I have like a fallback like that, but yeah. And then I think if it's like right now I'm in this kind of phase of shooting Venice really high ISO and taking advantage of a lot of the things that like come along with that. But then I also feel guilty about it. Like I've done this too much. I need to do something else.
Hmm.
So I think I'm always kind of feeling like I should be trying something different because it's gonna like force me to find something new, and like do things in a different way, and it's gonna like increase the variety of like my toolkit and like the way I can make things feel.
Hmm. You mentioned focal length being really important. Do you gravitate towards like the wider, longer lens? You're like, hey, if we just had to pick and we can carry one lens, it's like a 40 on 35. That's the
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, I think it's a little different on each project, but yeah, like if without considering a project, yes, 40 is probably or the 50, yeah. Um, unless I'm like fully embracing like this is wide looking, like this is a wide like then yeah, I'm more like in the long normal range is my go-to. But yeah, there's been a couple of projects I did with one project I did with Derek Cianfrance, who directed it, and As Much Is True. It was a commercial where we were both like, we hate wide lenses. Like, let's do this whole thing like with super wide lenses. And same with Miles J. The first time we worked together, he's a commercial director. Um, we same thing. Like the first time we worked together, it's like we both hate wide lenses, so let's do this whole thing just with really wide lenses. And then in the process of doing that, it's like, and this is years and years ago, but in the process of doing that, it's like, oh, this is why I hate
Hmm.
wide lenses. But if you do this, then there's like this great thing about them.
Hmm.
And you start to learn that like if the thing I'm reacting to is that like everything is in focus and I don't like that, then like how can you how can you break that? So like there's always something like so close to the lens that like it has to be out of focus. And then once that becomes a thing, it's like, okay, well, since I hate that, I hate when everything's in focus, like now I'm going to do wide lenses where everything is in focus. And like, that's the rule, and shoot everything at like a 22. And how am I going to make that feel okay? And so, yeah, so I think when I'm not being lazy, I think I'm trying to force things like that on myself so that I can like grow, because it's easy to just fall back into the same things you're comfortable with, and that's bad, I think.
Generally speaking, you seem to lean towards the wide open kind of look than the 16 kind of
Hmm.
look, right?
Hmm.
Your movies feel like shallow, deep of field mostly.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a crutch, and it's when I did Good Nurse, actually tried to shoot a little deeper, which I did, and I liked that, and it felt right to me. And then on um, Earth Mama, same thing. Like with 16, I sort of was like forcing myself to not do that. Um, and I think, it probably partially comes from like film school, or like a time when, it's like using a longer lens is like a crutch, because it's like you're not controlling what's around you. So it's like you don't want to see the background because it's wrong. It's not correct. It's literally like it can't be in the movie. So it's like if it's out of focus, that's fine. And so I think it initially probably came from that way of working, and just working on like really low budget things where you can't control the environment. Um, but and then like also the fact that it was like you couldn't like when I was a kid, and like we were we weren't shooting on film, and we were shooting on video. It was like there was no shallow depth of field because there weren't 35 or larger sensors. And so the way to like make it look like a movie was to make it shallower. And so I think that like stuck with me is like, well, this looks like fancy because it's like shallow depth of field. And then I got like really kind of obsessed by it when when I was doing Girls, the pilot for Girls, where it was like I really love the first AC from that show, and he taught me a lot. But it was like we were shooting wide open, and he was just like, you can't, this is great, like you can't shoot the whole show at a 1.3, like it's looks weird and it's like impossible. And I was like, yeah, I think we should do that. And it was like a kind of not an argument, but just a little bit of like we had a difference of opinion about it. But then I think like part of why the show looked the way it did, at least when I was working on it, was because of that. It wasn't that normal of a thing to see on like a bigger, or like on a, you know, HBO show, or like a real sort of like TV show, to have this really narrow depth of field. And I think it was one of the things that distinguished it. So I was like trying to really go as far as I could with that. And also with film too, it's sort of like it's too dangerous to do that. So it was like, well, let's do that, and it'll look unique. It'll have like a voice because it's not that common. Um, and then I started now. I use a Cinefade all the time, which I don't know if you guys have ever used that before, but it's a way of like changing the exposure with filters, um, like that you can adjust very, very specifically without having to change the iris. So doing exposure pulls and stuff like the depth of field just stays where it is. Or you can do depth of field pulls live, like in shot. So I always try to use one of those when I'm shooting digitally so that I can really precisely control the depth of field, and then it's like a choice rather than a necessity.
Yeah, those look really interesting. I've never had the chance to use them, but the depth of field pull for emotive effect, like
Mm-hmm.
pushing into a face, and all of a sudden you, instead of a dolly zoom, now you're just expanding the background a different way.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really cool. Oh, so what's you just wrapped up the latest one? How long ago?
It was a while ago. It was like in September.
Oh, nice. What's
Yeah.
what's next on the horizon?
I don't know. I've just been doing commercials since then, and which I kind of like going back and forth, like spending time doing long form and then spending time doing commercials. And like, there's things I really like about both and things I hate about both. And it's kind of like refreshing to go back and forth. And I also think like a lot of time people who work on commercials, like only they like think in a certain way, and then like people who only work on long form think in a certain way. And it's nice to kind of like draw ideas from like both of those worlds and like bring them to the other one, even though the people might be not happy about it. But yeah, yeah.
Do you are you gonna pursue your director career, or is something that you've done and that's it?
I don't have any interest in doing that right now. Really, ever since I started the Mr. Rogers movie, I felt much better about putting that down, and I feel like healthier for it and less like bogged down by this feeling of like I'm not doing enough, like I'm not writing enough, and I'm not whatever. And I feel much more like I can like turn off work more when I need to. So yeah, so right now, no. Maybe someday I'll be get interested in it again, but right now, no. Yeah.
Well, I'd say
I,
thank you. Yeah, this has
yeah.
been incredible. I know just a casual chat, but we really dived into some like specifics that I wasn't intending, which is awesome. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. So thank you so
Glad to
much,
hear it.
man, for kind of the deep dive in your process.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for talking, guys. It's good to meet you.